My name is Emma Carter. I'm 34 years old. A few months ago, I was standing in front of a building that I owned. That sentence still feels strange to say. The building wasn't fancy. It wasn't the tallest building in the city. Most people walked past it every day without noticing it. But for me, it meant everything. Because inside that building lived my parents. The same parents who had spent more than $500,000 helping my younger brother build his future. The same parents who once told me they couldn't afford to help me with college. The same parents who spent years believing I would never amount to much. And now, without them knowing it, they were paying rent in a building that belonged to me. Life has a strange sense of humor sometimes. I remember standing across the street that morning. A cup of coffee sat in my hands. The weather was cold. People rushed past me on their way to work. Nobody knew my story. Nobody knew how many nights I had cried myself to sleep. Nobody knew how many years I spent wondering what was wrong with me. Why wasn't I enough? Why was my brother always chosen first? Why did I always feel like a guest in my own family? Those questions followed me for years. For a long time, I believed the problem was me. Maybe I wasn't smart enough. Maybe I wasn't talented enough. Maybe I wasn't lovable enough. But I would eventually learn something important. The problem was never that I lacked value. The problem was that I kept looking for value in people who refused to see it. Of course, I didn't understand that back then. Back then, I was just a little girl, trying to make her parents proud. A little girl who thought good grades would finally earn attention. A little girl who believed hard work would eventually be noticed. A little girl who didn't know she was competing in a game she could never win. My younger brother Ryan was the center of everything, even when we were children, even before I understood what favoritism was. I could feel it, the difference, the imbalance, the invisible line that separated us. At first, I ignored it. I told myself I was imagining things. But as the years passed, the pattern became impossible to miss. And what happened next would shape the rest of my life. Because the favoritism didn't stop when we got older. It only became more expensive and much more painful. If you've ever felt overlooked by someone you loved, keep listening. You might understand this story better than anyone. Because what happened in my family started with something small. Something that seemed harmless at the time. But looking back now, I realize it was the first sign of everything that was coming. And I had no idea how much it would eventually cost me. Growing up, Ryan and I lived in the same house. We sat at the same dinner table. We went to the same schools. From the outside, we probably looked like a normal family. But inside the house, things felt very different. Ryan was 3 years younger than me. He was charming, funny, confident. People liked him easily, including my parents. I don't think they planned to treat us differently. At least, that's what I tell myself now. But intentions don't always change outcomes, and the outcome was clear. Ryan was the priority. I was the responsibility. When Ryan brought home an average report card, my parents celebrated his effort. When I brought home straight A's, they nodded and asked if I could do even better next time. At first, I thought that was normal. I thought maybe older children were expected to be more responsible. Maybe parents were harder on the first child. That's what I kept telling myself, but the differences kept growing. On Ryan's birthdays, there were big parties. Friends filled the backyard. Expensive gifts sat on the table. Everyone seemed excited. My birthdays were never ignored, but they felt smaller, quieter, less important. The difference was subtle, yet impossible to miss. One year, Ryan wanted a new gaming system. My parents bought it immediately. A few months later, I asked for a used laptop for school. They told me money was tight. I remember sitting in my room that night, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand how both things could be true, how money could be available one day and unavailable the next. But I never said anything. I didn't want to seem jealous. I didn't want to create problems. So I stayed quiet. That became a habit. Ryan made mistakes too. Everyone does. But his mistakes were treated differently. If he forgot homework, he was having a rough day. If I forgot homework, I was being careless. If he got into trouble, he was learning. If I got into trouble, I should have known better. Little by little, I started believing that I had to earn love, that I had to work harder, perform better, make fewer mistakes. I thought if I became perfect enough, everything would change. But perfection is a moving target. Every time I reached it, the goal moved again. Meanwhile, Ryan never seemed worried. Why would he be? The world kept telling him he was special. And my parents led that chorus. The older we got, the more obvious it became. Family conversations revolved around Ryan's future, his interests, his dreams, his opportunities. I listened from the sidelines, smiling when expected, nodding when necessary, pretending it didn't hurt. But it did hurt, more than I ever admitted. The hardest part wasn't the lack of attention. It was the hope, the constant hope that things would finally change. Every year I thought maybe this would be different. Maybe this would be the year they noticed me. Maybe this would be the year they saw how hard I was trying. But that year never came, and I didn't know it yet, but the gap between Ryan and me was about to become much larger. Because when high school ended, my parents would make a decision that changed both of our lives. A decision that would eventually cost them more than $500,000 and cost me something even more painful. High school was where I started noticing things more clearly. When you're a child, you explain everything away. You make excuses for people. You tell yourself things will get better. But as I got older, it became harder to ignore what was happening. I worked hard in school, not because anyone forced me to. I genuinely enjoyed learning. I liked solving problems. I liked setting goals and reaching them. By my senior year, I was near the top of my class. I joined clubs, volunteered after school, spent weekends studying. I thought my parents would be proud. And they were, at least for a few minutes. Then the conversation would return to Ryan. It always returned to Ryan. Ryan had started playing baseball. He wasn't a bad player, but every game felt like a national event in our house. Schedules were arranged around his practices. Family dinners became discussions about his future. My parents talked about scholarships, coaches, opportunities, potential. I remember one evening after receiving an academic award. It was one of the biggest achievements of my school years. I brought the certificate home. My hands were shaking with excitement. I showed it to my parents. My mother smiled. My father said, "That's nice." Then Ryan walked into the room. He wanted to talk about an upcoming tournament. Within seconds, everyone's attention shifted. The certificate stayed on the kitchen counter. Nobody mentioned it again. I wish I could say that was the moment I gave up. But it wasn't. I kept trying. That's what hurts most when I look back. I never stopped trying. I kept believing the next achievement would matter. the next accomplishment, the next milestone. I was always chasing a finish line that didn't exist. Around that time, college applications started becoming important. Most students were nervous. I was too. But I was also hopeful. I thought college would be my fresh start, a chance to build something for myself. I spent months researching schools, applying for scholarships, writing essays late into the night. Meanwhile, my parents were making plans for Ryan, not for college, not yet. For years ahead, they talked openly about saving for his future, his business ideas, his dreams, his opportunities. I sat at the same table listening. Sometimes they didn't even realize I was there. And then something happened that I still remember clearly. One night, I overheard my parents talking in the living room. They didn't know I was nearby. My father said something I'll never forget. He said, "Ryan is our investment. One day he'll take care of us." There was a long silence. Then my mother agreed, just like that. A simple conversation, a simple sentence. But it changed something inside me. Not because they believed in Ryan. I wanted them to believe in him. He was my brother. The painful part was realizing they didn't seem to believe in me, at least not in the same way. That realization stayed with me for years. Even now, I can remember exactly how it felt. Like standing outside a window, looking into a home where everyone belonged except you. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, I'd love to hear your experience in the comments. Because that feeling is difficult to explain unless you've lived it. And unfortunately, the hardest part was still ahead. Because when college acceptance letters arrived, my parents would make a choice that revealed exactly where I stood in the family. A choice that would affect the rest of my life. And the difference between how they treated Ryan and me was about to become impossible to ignore. The college acceptance letter arrived on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I still remember opening it at the kitchen table. My hands were trembling. My heart was racing. I had worked for that moment for years. Late nights, weekend study sessions, scholarship applications, part-time jobs. Everything had led to that envelope. And when I read the letter, I couldn't stop smiling. I had been accepted, not just accepted. Accepted into one of the best business programs in the state. For a few minutes, I felt proud, really proud. I imagined calling my parents, telling relatives, starting a new chapter. For the first time in a long time, I thought maybe things were changing. Maybe they would finally see me differently. That evening, I showed the letter to my parents. My mother smiled politely. My father nodded. They congratulated me, but something felt off. The excitement I expected wasn't there. The room felt strangely quiet. A few days later, I learned why. My parents asked me to sit down with them. I remember the serious look on their faces. My stomach immediately tightened. My father cleared his throat. Then he said something that changed everything. "Emma, we're proud of you." He paused. "But we can't afford to help you with college." I stared at him. At first, I thought I had misunderstood. I knew money wasn't unlimited. I understood that. But I also knew my parents had savings. I knew they had been planning for years, so hearing those words felt confusing. My mother quickly added that they would support me emotionally. They encouraged me to apply for more financial aid, take out student loans, work while studying. Many students did it. I nodded. What else could I do? I didn't argue. I didn't cry. Not in front of them. I simply accepted it. That night, I sat alone in my room, looking at the acceptance letter. trying to figure out how I would make everything work. The next few months became a blur. I applied for every scholarship I could find. I picked up extra work hours, I borrowed money, I budgeted every dollar. When college finally started, I shared a small apartment with roommates. The furniture was old. The kitchen barely worked, but it was mine. I was proud of it. At least that's what I told myself. Then something happened that made the situation much harder to accept. A few months into my first semester, Ryan started talking about his future plans. He wasn't even close to college yet, but my parents were already making preparations. At first, I didn't think much about it. Then little details started appearing: conversations, purchases, financial decisions. One afternoon, I came home for a holiday break. While helping my mother organize paperwork, I accidentally saw documents on the kitchen table. I wasn't snooping, they were sitting in plain sight. And what I saw left me speechless. My parents had purchased an expensive investment account for Ryan's future, a very expensive one. The amount was more money than I had borrowed for an entire year of college. I remember staring at the numbers, trying to process them. A strange feeling settled over me. Not anger, not jealousy, something deeper: disappointment. Because suddenly, the conversation from months earlier didn't make sense anymore. The problem wasn't that they couldn't help. The problem was that they had chosen who to help. And for the first time in my life, I saw the situation clearly. Ryan wasn't receiving support because resources existed. Resources existed because Ryan was receiving support. The difference may sound small, but it changed everything. That realization stayed with me throughout college. Every long shift at work, every loan payment, every sleepless night. And unfortunately, things were only getting started. Because over the next several years, my parents would pour more and more money into Ryan's future. Money that would eventually exceed $500,000. Money they believed would secure their future. But life doesn't always follow the plans we make. And neither did Ryan. What happened next would become the beginning of the biggest mistake my parents ever made. After college, Ryan became the center of the family's future plans. Not just emotionally, financially too. By then, I had graduated and started working. My first job wasn't glamorous. The pay wasn't great. The hours were long. But I was grateful to have it. I paid my bills, made my student loan payments, and tried to build a stable life. Meanwhile, Ryan had bigger dreams, at least according to my parents. He talked constantly about becoming an entrepreneur, starting businesses, making millions, retiring young. Every family dinner seemed to include another exciting idea. One month it was an online company. The next month it was a retail business. Then it was something completely different. The ideas changed often, but my parents' belief in him never did. At first, they helped with small amounts of money, then larger amounts, then even larger amounts. Years passed, the numbers kept growing. Whenever I visited home, there seemed to be another investment, another loan, another opportunity, another check. And every time Ryan failed, my parents called it a learning experience. They never asked him to slow down. They never questioned the decisions. They simply gave him another chance. I wish I could say I wasn't paying attention, but I was. Not because I wanted their money. I never expected that anymore. What hurt was watching them believe in him so completely. The same belief I had spent my entire life trying to earn. One evening, my father called me unexpectedly. His voice sounded excited. He told me they were helping Ryan launch his biggest business yet. The investment was substantial, far larger than anything before. I remember sitting silently on the phone, listening, doing the math in my head. The total amount they had spent on Ryan over the years was becoming enormous, hundreds of thousands of dollars. Eventually, it would pass 500,000, but nobody seemed worried. They viewed it as an investment, a future payoff, a guarantee. Ryan would succeed eventually. At least that was the belief. The problem was that reality wasn't cooperating. His businesses never seemed to last. Some failed quickly. Others struggled for years. Excuses always followed. Bad timing, bad partners, bad luck. Something was always responsible. Everything except Ryan himself. One afternoon, I carefully tried to express concern. Not criticism, concern. I suggested that maybe they should protect some of their savings, just in case. The room became uncomfortable immediately. My father frowned. My mother looked disappointed. Ryan laughed, actually laughed. Then he looked at me and said something I'll never forget. Maybe you're just jealous because nobody wants to invest in you. The room went silent. For a second, I thought someone would correct him. Nobody did. Instead, my father defended him. He said Ryan was under a lot of pressure. My mother suggested I shouldn't take it personally. I sat there stunned, not because of Ryan's comment. I had heard worse. What hurt was seeing everyone treat it as acceptable, like my feelings didn't matter, like I should simply absorb the insult and move on. The dinner continued. People changed the subject. Conversations resumed. But something inside me had shifted, completely. That night, I drove home alone. The road was dark. The radio was off. I barely remember the drive. I only remember the feeling. Years of disappointment, years of trying, years of hoping, all catching up at once. When I got home, I sat in my apartment and cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly. The kind of crying that comes when you're finally too tired to pretend everything is okay. And somewhere during that night, I made a decision that would change the course of my life. I stopped chasing their approval. I stopped trying to prove my worth. I stopped waiting for someone else to see my value. Because for the first time, I realized something important. Maybe the problem wasn't that I hadn't earned their respect. Maybe the problem was that I was asking the wrong people for it. And once that thought entered my mind, everything began to change. What I didn't know was that my family's world was already starting to crack beneath the surface. And while I was preparing to build my own future, the future they had spent over $500,000 creating was about to face its first real test. After that dinner, I stopped calling home as often, not out of anger, not out of revenge. I was simply tired of fighting for a place that never seemed to belong to me, tired of hoping every conversation would be different. Tired of leaving family gatherings feeling smaller than when I arrived. So I created some distance, not a dramatic distance, just enough to protect my peace. I still answered calls. I still visited on holidays. I still wished everyone happy birthdays. But emotionally, something had changed. I stopped expecting anything, and strangely, that helped. For the first time in years, I wasn't measuring my worth through my family's approval. I started focusing on my own life, my own goals, my own future. At the time, my life wasn't impressive, at least not by social media standards. I lived in a small apartment, drove an old car, worked long hours, Some months felt like nothing but work and bills. There were nights when I ate simple meals because I was trying to save money. There were weekends when I stayed home because going out felt like an unnecessary expense. I wasn't miserable, but I wasn't comfortable either. I was building, slowly, quietly, one step at a time. The loneliness was harder than the financial struggle. People don't talk about that enough. When you pull away from family, even for healthy reasons, there can be a strange emptiness. You miss what you wish the relationship could have been. Not necessarily what it actually was. I missed having people who believed in me. I missed feeling important to someone. Sometimes I would see friends receiving support from their parents. A phone call, encouragement, simple interest in their lives, and I would wonder what that felt like. Then I would remind myself that comparison never helped anything. So I focused on what I could control, my work, my habits, my future. Around that time, I started becoming interested in personal finance. At first, it was practical. I wanted to pay off debt, build savings, create stability, nothing more. But the more I learned, the more fascinated I became. I read books after work, listened to podcasts during my commute, studied investing on weekends. Most of it was confusing at first, but I kept learning, little by little. The same way I had always approached challenges, one step at a time. Meanwhile, Ryan's life seemed to continue exactly as before. Every time I heard news from home, there was another project, another business idea, another investment. My parents continued supporting him, even when the results weren't there. I stopped offering advice. Nobody wanted it. And honestly, I no longer felt responsible. That chapter of my life was ending. A different one was beginning. The strange thing was that once I stopped focusing on what everyone else was doing, my life started feeling lighter. Not easier, just lighter. I slept better, thought more clearly, worried less. For years, I had carried the burden of proving myself. Now I was finally putting it down. I didn't know where my path would lead. I certainly wasn't imagining wealth, or success, or owning buildings. At that point, I was simply trying to build a stable future. Nothing more, nothing less. But life has a way of rewarding consistency. Not immediately, not dramatically, but eventually. And while my family was still focused on Ryan's next opportunity, I was about to discover an opportunity of my own. A small decision, one that didn't seem important at the time. Yet years later, I would look back and realize it changed everything. Because the next step I took would quietly begin transforming my future. And nobody in my family even noticed it happening. The opportunity that changed my life didn't look special at first. In fact, most people would have ignored it. I almost did. One evening after work, I was sitting in my apartment reading an article about investing. It mentioned something called rental properties. The idea seemed simple. Buy a property, rent it out, build income over time. At first, I laughed. Buying property felt impossible. I was still paying off student loans. My savings weren't impressive. I didn't come from money. Nobody was handing me opportunities. But something about the idea stayed with me. For weeks, I kept researching. Then months, I learned everything I could. Books, podcasts, online courses, free videos, anything I could find. The more I learned, the more interested I became. Not because I wanted to become rich, at least not then. I wanted freedom. I wanted security. I wanted to know that my future wasn't dependent on anyone else's approval. So I started saving more aggressively. I tracked every expense, skipped unnecessary purchases, worked extra hours. Some friends thought I was being too careful. Maybe I was. But every dollar felt like a small step toward something bigger. Eventually, after years of saving, I had enough money for a small investment. Not a dream property, not anything impressive, just a small rental unit in an average neighborhood. I remember signing the paperwork. My hands were shaking. Part of me felt excited. The other part felt terrified. What if I failed? What if I lost everything? What if everyone was right about me? But I signed anyway. That property taught me more than any book ever could. Nothing went perfectly. Repairs appeared unexpectedly. One tenant stopped paying rent. A plumbing issue drained a large portion of my savings. For a while, I wondered if I had made a huge mistake. But unlike many things in my life, this challenge belonged to me. The successes were mine, the failures were mine, and somehow that felt empowering. I wasn't waiting for approval anymore. I was building something, one decision at a time, one lesson at a time. Years passed. Slowly, my confidence grew. Then something surprising happened. The property started performing well, not amazingly, just steadily. And steady turned out to be powerful. I reinvested what I earned, saved more money, learned more skills, then purchased another small property, then another. Nothing happened overnight. There were no dramatic breakthroughs, no lottery tickets, no lucky breaks. Just patience, consistency, and time. Meanwhile, life at home continued. Following a very different path, Ryan was still chasing success. My parents were still supporting him. The amounts they invested kept growing. Every year the total became larger. Every year their confidence remained strong. And every year they seemed completely unaware of what I was quietly building. Not that I blamed them. I wasn't talking about it. I wasn't posting about it online. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. For the first time in my life, I was doing something for myself. And strangely, that felt enough. Have you ever reached a point where you stopped trying to prove yourself to people? If you have, then you probably understand what I mean. There's a certain peace that comes with it, a certain freedom. But life wasn't finished surprising me, not even close. Because while I was slowly building stability, my family was moving toward a problem they couldn't see. A problem hidden beneath years of optimism and expensive decisions. And one phone call was about to reveal just how serious that problem had become. A phone call that would change everything. The phone call came on a Thursday afternoon. I was reviewing paperwork for one of my properties when my mother's name appeared on my screen. That alone felt unusual. We still spoke occasionally, but our conversations had become shorter over the years, more polite, more careful. Healthy boundaries have a way of changing relationships, not necessarily for the worse, just differently. I answered the call. Immediately, I could tell something was wrong. My mother's voice sounded tired, not physically tired, emotionally tired. The kind of tired that comes after carrying worry for too long. For a few minutes, she talked about ordinary things, the weather, family updates, small conversations. Then she finally told me why she had called. Ryan's latest business was in trouble, serious trouble. At first, I wasn't shocked. His businesses had struggled before. But this felt different. The numbers were larger, the risks were bigger, and the consequences were real. For years, every setback had been explained away. This time, there were no easy explanations. There were debts, missed payments, legal concerns, financial pressure. the kind that keeps people awake at night. I listened quietly. Part of me felt sad, not satisfied, not victorious, just sad. Because despite everything, Ryan was still my brother, and my parents were still my parents. I didn't want them to suffer. I never had. People often imagine that being proven right feels amazing. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it just feels heavy. After the call ended, I sat quietly for a long time, thinking, reflecting, remembering. All those years, all those investments, all those sacrifices. More than $500,000 had eventually gone toward Ryan's future. Business ventures, loans, equipment, opportunities, second chances, third chances, fourth chances. My parents had believed they were building security. Instead, they had built dependence. The realization hurt, not because I wanted to judge them, because I understood something they were only beginning to learn. Love and support are important, but unlimited rescue can sometimes become its own problem. Over the next year, things became more difficult for them. I heard updates from relatives, occasional phone calls, small pieces of information. Ryan's financial situation continued declining. The pressure on my parents increased. Eventually, difficult decisions had to be made. Assets were sold, plans changed, retirement expectations shifted. The future they had imagined looked very different now. Meanwhile, my own life kept moving forward. The rental properties continued growing, slowly, steadily. I wasn't becoming rich overnight, but the foundation I had spent years building was becoming stronger. And the funny thing was, nobody really noticed. Not my family, not old classmates, not former coworkers. I had spent so many years wishing people would notice me. Now they didn't, and I no longer cared. That freedom felt priceless. Then one day I received another update. This one caught my attention. My parents had moved. They could no longer afford the lifestyle they once expected, so they downsized. They rented an apartment in a modest building across town. When I heard the address, something strange happened. The address sounded familiar, very familiar. At first, I thought it was a coincidence. Then I checked my records. I opened Part 9. The phone call came on a Thursday afternoon. I was reviewing paperwork for one of my properties when my phone started ringing. It was my mother. That alone felt unusual. We still spoke occasionally, but our conversations had become shorter over the years, more polite than personal. For a moment, I considered letting the call go to voicemail. Then I answered. The second I heard her voice, I knew something was wrong. She sounded exhausted, not physically, emotionally. There was a heaviness in her words that I hadn't heard before. We talked for a few minutes, mostly small talk. Then she finally told me the reason she called. Ryan's latest business had failed. Completely. Not struggling, not slowing down. Failed. The silence that followed felt strange, not because I was surprised. Honestly, part of me had expected something like this eventually. What surprised me was hearing it from her. For years, every setback had been described as temporary. Every problem had a positive explanation. Every mistake had a reason. This time was different. This time there was no optimism in her voice, only worry. As the conversation continued, more details emerged. The debts were significant, much larger than I realized. Several investments had disappeared. Loans remained unpaid. Partnerships had collapsed. Money that had taken my parents decades to save was suddenly gone. Years of financial support, years of sacrifices, years of believing Ryan would eventually succeed. All of it had led here. I listened quietly. I didn't criticize anyone. There was no point. The damage had already been done. And strangely, I didn't feel satisfaction. I know some people might expect that. After everything that happened, maybe I should have felt vindicated. Maybe I should have enjoyed being right. But I didn't. I felt sad, because despite everything, they were still my family. And hearing pain in my mother's voice hurt more than I expected. Over the following months, their situation became more difficult. The financial pressure increased, expenses had to be reduced, plans changed, assets were sold. Eventually, my parents made a decision they never imagined making. They downsized. The large home where we grew up was sold. The house that had held decades of memories disappeared from their lives. When I heard the news, I sat quietly for a long time. I wasn't sad about the building itself. I was sad about what it represented. The end of an era, the collapse of a future they had spent years trying to create. A future built almost entirely around Ryan. A few weeks later, my mother mentioned they had moved into an apartment building. Nothing fancy, just a comfortable place they could afford. She gave me the address casually during a conversation. At first, the address meant nothing to me. Then I froze. I knew that address very well. In fact, I had seen it dozens of times. Because years earlier, one of my investment partnerships had purchased ownership shares in that exact building. Over time, I had quietly increased my stake, then increased it again and again. Eventually, I became the majority owner. I remember staring at my phone after the call ended, my heart beating faster. The coincidence seemed impossible. Out of all the buildings in the city, out of all the places they could have moved, my parents had unknowingly rented an apartment in a building I owned. For several minutes, I simply sat there, thinking, processing, trying to understand the strange twist life had created. Part of me wanted to laugh, part of me wanted to cry, but mostly I felt disbelief. The irony was almost too much. The daughter they had underestimated for years now owned the building where they lived, and they had absolutely no idea. At first, I considered telling them immediately. Then I changed my mind. Something told me to wait. Not because I wanted revenge, not because I wanted a dramatic reveal, but because I wasn't sure what good would come from it. So I stayed silent. Life continued. Months passed. My parents paid rent, visited occasionally, spoke with me more often than before, and all the while they remained completely unaware of the truth. But secrets have a way of finding daylight, especially secrets written on official ownership records. And sooner or later, someone was going to discover exactly who owned that building. When that day arrived, everything would change, and the reaction would be something I never expected. For nearly 6 months, nobody knew, at least nobody in my family. Life continued normally. My parents settled into their apartment. Ryan moved between different jobs, trying to recover from years of failed business ventures, and I continued building my life quietly. The strange thing was that my relationship with my parents slowly started improving, not dramatically, not overnight, but little by little. For the first time in years, our conversations felt more balanced. My mother started asking questions about my work. My father occasionally called just to check in. Those small moments might not sound important, but for me, they were. Because growing up, those conversations rarely happened. I wasn't suddenly becoming their favorite child. That wasn't the point. The point was that they were finally starting to see me as a person, not just as Ryan's sister, not just as the daughter who would figure things out on her own, a real person with a real life. And honestly, that meant more to me than I expected. One afternoon, I stopped by the apartment building for a routine meeting with the property manager. Nothing unusual, just business. The building was performing well. Occupancy was high. Maintenance costs were under control. Everything looked good. As I was leaving, I noticed my father walking through the lobby. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he smiled. A genuine smile. The kind I hadn't seen often growing up. We stood there talking for almost 20 minutes. Simple conversation, nothing important. Yet somehow it felt important, because for once, there were no comparisons. No discussions about Ryan, no competition. Just father and daughter talking. When I drove home that evening, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Life had become strange. The people who once overlooked me were slowly becoming part of my life again. Not because I had demanded it, not because I had forced it, because time had changed things. And maybe hardship had changed them too. Then came the moment everything shifted. A routine maintenance issue had occurred in the building. Several residents received notices regarding repairs. One of those notices included information about ownership and management contacts. Normally, nobody pays attention to those details. This time, someone did. A few days later, my phone rang. It was my mother. Her voice sounded different, confused, almost shocked. "Emma," she said carefully, "I need to ask you something." I already knew. Before she even finished the sentence, I knew. There was a long pause. Then she asked, "Do you own our building?" Silence filled the line. I looked out the window, took a slow breath, and answered honestly, "Yes." Another silence followed, longer this time. I could hear her breathing. I could almost feel her trying to process the information. Finally, she spoke again. "Since when?" When I told her the truth, she became quiet, very quiet, because the answer wasn't recent. I hadn't purchased the building after their financial struggles. I hadn't bought it because of them. I had been building toward that ownership for years, patiently, quietly, one investment at a time, one property at a time. The realization seemed to hit her all at once. Everything she thought she knew about me suddenly looked different. A few days later, my parents asked if we could meet. Not at the apartment, not over the phone, face to face. I agreed. Part of me felt nervous. Part of me felt calm. Because this wasn't about proving anything anymore. That chapter of my life was over. I didn't need validation. I didn't need apologies. I didn't need recognition. But as the meeting approached, I couldn't help wondering what they wanted to say. Had they finally connected all the pieces? Had they realized how much they had overlooked? Or would this simply become another uncomfortable conversation? I honestly didn't know. What I did know was this: for the first time in my life, the truth was impossible to ignore. And when we finally sat down together, years of unspoken feelings would finally come to the surface. Not with anger, not with shouting, but with something far more powerful: the truth. The meeting took place 3 days later. We met at a small restaurant near the apartment building. Nothing fancy, just a quiet place where people could talk. I arrived a few minutes early. As I sat there waiting, I felt surprisingly calm. Years ago, I would have been nervous, desperate to say the right thing, desperate to be understood. But something had changed. I no longer needed anyone's permission to feel valuable. I no longer needed anyone to confirm my worth. That freedom made all the difference. A few minutes later, my parents walked in. Ryan came too. The moment felt strange, not uncomfortable, just emotional. Like everyone understood that something important needed to be said. For a while, we talked about ordinary things, the food, the weather, work, anything except the obvious topic. Then finally my father looked at me. His expression was different than I had ever seen before. Older, softer, more thoughtful. He cleared his throat. Then he asked quietly, "Why didn't you tell us?" I already knew what he meant. I took a sip of water, then answered honestly, "Because it wasn't about you." The table fell silent. I explained that I hadn't bought properties to prove anything. I hadn't worked hard because I wanted revenge. I wasn't secretly waiting for a moment to surprise them. I had simply been building my life, one step at a time, for myself, for my future, not for anyone else's approval. My father looked down at the table. My mother wiped her eyes. And for the first time in years, nobody interrupted. Nobody changed the subject. Nobody redirected the conversation back to Ryan. They listened, really listened. Then something happened that I never expected. My father apologized. Not a quick apology, not a polite apology. A real one. The kind that comes from reflection. The kind that takes courage. He admitted they had focused too much on Ryan. He admitted they had assumed I would always be okay on my own. He admitted they had overlooked things they should have noticed. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. I had imagined that moment many times growing up. But when it finally arrived, it felt different than expected. Less satisfying, more emotional. Because no apology can change the past, but it can change the future. Then my mother spoke. Tears filled her eyes. She told me she was proud of me, not because I owned buildings, not because I had succeeded financially, but because I had built a life despite everything. Hearing those words affected me more than I expected. Part of me had waited years to hear them. Another part of me no longer needed them. Both feelings existed at the same time. Then Ryan spoke. Honestly, I wasn't sure what he would say. For years, he had been the center of everything. The favorite child, the family investment, the future. But life had humbled him. You could see it. He admitted he had taken things for granted. He admitted he had relied too much on our parents. He admitted that he hadn't understood what my experience was like. The conversation lasted hours. Nobody argued. Nobody raised their voice. The truth didn't need shouting. It was powerful enough on its own. By the time we left the restaurant, something had shifted. Not perfectly, not magically, but genuinely. The walls that had existed for years were finally starting to come down. As we walked outside, my father stopped beside me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said something simple, something that stayed with me. He said, "For the first time, I think I understand how much we missed." I looked at him, and for the first time in a very long time, I believed he meant it. If you were in my position, what would you do? Would you forgive them? Would you keep your distance? I'd genuinely love to hear your thoughts in the comments, because forgiveness sounds simple until you're the one carrying the history. And while that conversation brought healing, something even more important was about to happen. For the first time in our lives, my family wasn't just talking differently. They were starting to change. And that change would teach me a lesson about success that I will never forget. After that conversation, something unexpected happened. Nobody changed overnight. There was no dramatic transformation, no movie-style ending. Real life doesn't work that way. But little by little, things became different. My parents started calling more often, not because they needed money, not because there was a problem. Sometimes they called just to ask how I was doing. That may sound like a small thing, but for me, it wasn't. For most of my life, conversations had felt one-sided. Now they felt genuine, balanced, natural. For the first time, I felt seen. At the same time, I made sure to keep healthy boundaries. That was important. Forgiveness doesn't mean pretending the past never happened. It doesn't mean accepting unhealthy behavior again. I loved my family, but I also respected myself, so I learned something that took years to understand. You can forgive people without giving them unlimited access to your peace. That lesson changed everything. As the months passed, my business continued growing, quietly, the same way it always had. One property became several, several became many. The numbers improved, the opportunities grew. But I wasn't chasing status anymore. I wasn't trying to prove anyone wrong. I wasn't trying to show people what they missed. I was simply building a life I enjoyed. And strangely, that made success feel much better. Around that time, I met an investor at a business conference. He was incredibly successful, the kind of person people usually wait in line to talk to. We ended up having a simple conversation, nothing special. At least that's what I thought. A few weeks later, he contacted me. He wanted to discuss a partnership opportunity. I remember reading the message several times, not because of the money, because of what it represented. Years earlier, I had spent so much energy trying to convince people I was capable. Now successful people were approaching me because of my work. Not because I asked, not because I begged, because they saw value in what I had built. That felt different, very different. At the same time, another change was happening. As my business grew, I found myself thinking about younger people, people who reminded me of myself, hardworking, overlooked, trying to build something with very little support. So I started mentoring young entrepreneurs. Nothing formal, just conversations, advice, encouragement. Sometimes all people need is one person who believes in them. I know that because I spent years wishing someone believed in me. Helping them became one of the most rewarding parts of my life. And then something happened that brought everything full circle. One evening, my mother asked if we could talk privately, just the two of us. We sat together for nearly 2 hours. During that conversation, she apologized again. But this time it felt different, deeper, more honest. She admitted there were moments she remembered clearly now. Moments when she should have supported me more. Moments when she should have listened. Moments when she should have noticed. Neither of us cried much. We simply talked. Openly, honestly. And when the conversation ended, I felt something leave my shoulders. A weight I had carried for years, not because the past disappeared, but because I finally stopped carrying it. That was the real victory. Not the properties, not the money, not the building, peace. That was the victory. For so long, I thought success would feel like proving everyone wrong. I thought it would feel like standing on top of a mountain and saying, "Look at me now." But that's not what happened. Success felt quieter. Success felt like waking up without anger. Success felt like no longer needing validation. Success felt like being happy, regardless of who noticed. Standing outside that building today, I sometimes think about the journey, the forgotten daughter, the overlooked child. the girl who spent years trying to earn love, and the woman who finally learned she never needed to earn her value in the first place. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's this. Sometimes people only see your value after you stop trying to prove it. And sometimes your greatest success isn't wealth. It isn't recognition. It isn't revenge. It's peace. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever worked hard while nobody seemed to notice, then this story is for you. Because your value doesn't depend on who sees it. And one day, you'll realize that was your greatest strength all along.